I have never told anyone about what happened to me in September 2008. I was so traumatized by the creature I saw that I was never able to bring myself to talk about it. I'm not sure why I am writing this now, but sometime last year I lost touch with an old friend of mine that I hung out with when it happened, and all at once it dawned on me that if anything were to happen to him, or to me, no one would ever know what we had seen. If that creature is still out there, then maybe some good could be done by putting my story out there. But first things first, my name is Luke, and on September 18th, 2008, I had just returned home from a volleyball camp. It was my first day back, and I had plans to meet up with some high school friends. I was a college freshman at the time, and though my school is not too far away from where I live, it takes 1 to 1.5 hours to get there by car or bus, so I didn't really get to see my high school friends when I was away in college. Anyway, on this particular night, my friends and I were going to meet at the depot, which is now called something else, but used to be an old depot that had been converted into a restaurant bar spot on Main Street. I got myself cleaned up and walked about 15 minutes through downtown Statesboro until I arrived at the depot. I figured I could use the exercise to keep me limber, and that if we stayed too late, someone could drop me back home. We planned to meet at 8:30, and I arrived a little after 8 o'clock, so I decided to go in alone and get an appetizer while I waited for my friends. Everyone finally arrived, and we sat around talking and catching up when one of them asked if we had heard on the news about a strange, wild creature that had been sighted on the edge of town. The creature had been sighted a few nights prior, and although descriptions of the creature were sketchy on details, some were saying that it was about 7 feet tall with long brown hair. It was also reported to be quite aggressive, and several people were concerned that their pets could be harmed. Some of my friends said that they had heard the stories, and my friend Scott told me that the sighting was out near his grandparents' house and that he had been meaning to ask them if they knew anything. I was sort of creeped out by the creature story and kept staring out the window thinking about this thing and how I had walked there alone. As it turned out, 3 of us left the depot together with 2 others staying behind. So me, Luke, James, a friend from high school, and Scott, another high school buddy, set out in Scott's car, who had agreed to drive us home. I was so thankful in that minute that I didn't have to walk until, as soon as we were pulling out of the parking lot, Scott said, "Hey, let's drive out to my grandparents' house and see if we can find this thing." I was 100% reluctant to go, but my friends badgered me into it. In the end, it didn't take us long to get there, and I remember asking Scott why he wanted to find this creature so badly. He said, "Hey, I just want to see what all the fuss is about and if it's real." I didn't really think we would find it, so I just shrugged it off and we drove on. As we got out towards the edge of town where his grandparents lived, there were roads with no sidewalks, and once you're out there in the middle of nowhere, nature takes over again, and there are fewer homes and therefore fewer cars on the road. As soon as we got to the area where Scott's grandparents lived, we turned onto a side road, and something ran out into our view from off in the brush beside a house on our left. And there it stood in the middle of the street, right in front of the car. My first reaction was, "Holy crap," because I had no idea what I was looking at. It didn't look like a bear or dog, more like some sort of ape standing on 2 legs with dog-like features, but it could have been some weird, wild dog. But that didn't make sense because the creature was about 7 feet tall and had hair that looked extremely matted and mangy, even though its fur was dark brown in color. This creature also had yellow eyes, shocking yellow eyes that burned right into your skin. I felt uncomfortable just looking into them. Anybody would. It scared the hell out of me when I made eye contact with this thing because it seemed to know exactly why we were there, like it knew we were looking for it. But maybe I'm reading too much into things now thinking back on it. Anyway, we 3 sat there staring at it and each other, the 3 of us sitting in the car wide-eyed, and the creature standing in the middle of the road in the headlights, staring back at us. We just sat there frozen for a minute as Dogman and Man stared at each other. And that's when the thing growled with his mouth open, almost like a hissing growl, which definitely got the message across to us. And then it abruptly turned around and walked back off into the woods where he had come from. The three of us just sat there stunned until Scott said, "Let's go get him." I instantly shook my head, no, but Scott wanted to get out and run after it because he didn't believe in it. He thought it was a made-up story and that this was someone running with it and toying with anyone who came around looking for an encounter. I told him he was crazy, but he was adamant about chasing it, so he jumped out of the car and took off after it. James and I stayed in the car. I will let you know that that thing did not seem fake to me. Scott ran across the field and into the trees after the dog man. We heard him scream and watched him stop when he got tangled in a pile of old barbed wire fencing that was between him and where it had run to. And that's when we all noticed the dog man too, further past Scott and also stuck in a pile of barbed wire fencing. The creature had made the same mistake as Scott and got entangled in the barbed wire. James and I figured we had no choice but to head over and try to help Scott. When we finally got to him, he had mostly untangled himself, and with our help, he was free in under a minute. The three of us ran back to the car, but we could all still hear the thing struggling to free itself from the wire. We listened to it struggle for about 2 minutes before we heard everything go silent. All we could assume was that it had gotten itself loose, and that's when Scott hit the gas and got us out of there. I can barely remember getting home that night. I do remember waking up the next morning and saying to myself, what a crazy dream that was. We didn't talk about it for the next few days, but when we did finally get into it, we found out that all three of us were all dealing with similar effects, scared of noises and sudden movements, unable to sleep, all stuff like that. To this day, we've all three tried to get over it by just not thinking about it, and eventually we did get past the worst of it. But every time I see a dog in the distance or hear a twig snap, I get that feeling of pure terror, regardless if it's real or not. I've heard stories about people going crazy after an encounter with one of these things. I'm hoping that's not going to be me. It's been years since that night, but the memory still feels fresh. I was 17, living that sweet spot between kid and adult, and summer was stretching out, promising endless days of freedom. A camping trip with my best friends seemed like the perfect way to soak it all up. Willow Creek was supposed to be this peaceful escape, a place to bond over campfires and ghost stories. Instead, it became a nightmare I can't shake. We'd been up late, laughing and swapping stories when this weird feeling washed over me. Like something was wrong, really wrong. I crept out of my tent, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a shape moving through the trees. Then my eyes adjusted and I saw it clearly. Tall, way too tall, with skin pale as moonlight and eyes that seemed to glow. Its face was wrong, like something out of a really bad horror movie, and the way it moved, it was like it didn't belong in our world. I froze, my mind racing. It was like something out of a bad dream, but this was real. It was standing there, looking at me, and for a second, I thought it was going to come closer. I ran like I'd never run before, heart pounding, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I was far away from the campsite, hidden in the underbrush. When I finally calmed down, I crept back to the campsite, hoping it was all a crazy dream. But my friends were still asleep, and the spot where I'd seen that thing was empty. We packed up and left as soon as the sun was up, not saying a word about what I'd seen. I've tried to forget about it over the years, but sometimes, late at night, I see those eyes in my mind. It's like a part of me is still out there in that woods, scared and alone. I've had nightmares about it ever since. Sometimes I wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. My friends tried to be there for me, but they couldn't understand what I was going through. They thought it was just a bad dream, a figment of my overactive imagination. I started avoiding the woods, Any place with trees made me nervous. I'd find myself scanning the shadows, looking for anything out of the ordinary. It was exhausting. People would tell me to forget about it, to move on. But how do you move on from something like that? It was like a part of me had been irrevocably changed. I tried to find information about similar encounters, but there was nothing. No news reports, no internet forums. It was like it hadn't happened at all, except for the terror that lived inside me. Over the years, the intensity of the fear has lessened, but it's never completely gone away. It's like a scar, a constant reminder of that night. Now, as I sit here writing this, I feel a strange sense of peace. Maybe by putting it into words, I can finally start to let go. Or maybe, just maybe, there's someone else out there who knows what I'm talking about. Someone who can tell me I'm not alone. I don't know why I'm writing this down now. Maybe it's time to stop being scared. Maybe someone else has seen something like this, and they won't think I'm crazy. I live in Northern Virginia and used to love getting out and exploring some of the lesser-known spots in the area. There is a park that almost no one knows about that's a real throwback to pre-Civil War times. It contains completely untouched antebellum homesteads, a Revolutionary War wagon route, old Civil War trenches, and quite a few random graves. I'm fascinated with that era, so it was always interesting to look around there. It's all located along a trail behind fancy neighborhoods and golf courses. The trail's over 20 miles long, but I guess most people don't have time for that kind of history. I was there one day and came upon an old brick chimney. There was no sign of the house that used to surround it, just the chimney standing alone. It was in a kind of clearing that, surprisingly, didn't look very overgrown. There was a little hearth in front of the chimney with a small stone fireplace opening. What struck me was how clean it looked, as if someone had swept it recently. I poked around and spotted a little trail at the edge of the clearing. I followed it into the woods about 100 feet and came to where there was a 3-foot-tall stone wall marking out a rectangular piece of property. On one edge, I found an old stairway leading down to what I assumed was a stone cellar. There was a wooden door down there that was slightly propped open. It started to feel a little creepy, but I was so fascinated that I couldn't help but go down to take a look. I pulled the door open and turned on my flashlight. Inside, there was a wooden table and a couple of chairs. Wooden shelves lined the walls, and I saw old glass jars of food on them, what looked like flour, cornmeal, seeds, and such. There were a few piles of stuff, old rags and clothes. I started thinking that maybe somebody was squatting there. I shined my flashlight around and saw that the cellar extended far back. There was a short passage that led to another area. I went through to a small room. It was mostly dirt, more like a hidey hole than anything. There was this black powdery stuff on the floors against the walls. In one spot, there was a little pile that looked like old rotten fruit. I didn't know what to think. I kept wondering if it was a person or an animal who'd been hanging out there. I didn't have much more time to explore that day, so I left and headed home. It was probably about a month later before I was back in that area. I'd had a hard day at work, and it always calmed me down to get out on the trail and let go of some stress. I'd found what looked like an old family graveyard and was trying to read the names and dates. Some of the names were so faded, but I got really into trying to figure out some of the family history. It had gotten later than I realized and was starting to rain. I wasn't prepared with a hat or raincoat or anything, but this graveyard was really close to that old chimney I'd found before. I decided to go wait it out in that cellar since I was at least a mile from my car. I was sure it wouldn't rain for long. I found the chimney without any trouble and headed for the cellar. The door was a bit open like before, and I went in and sat in one of the chairs. I always carry a notebook and pen, so I pulled those out along with my flashlight and started making some notes. Part of me always thought I'd eventually write a little history book of the area. I was there less than half an hour when I started hearing some rustling noises. I thought maybe there was an animal down the passageway in the little room. It was just soft rustling at first, so I thought maybe it was some mice or something. But then the rustling got pretty loud, and I thought I heard a weird flapping sound. By then, I was freaking out, thinking it was a bat or something. I stuffed my things in my pockets and headed for the door. I was glad it had stopped raining. I made sure to leave the door open and went up the stairs. It was around dusk, but I was curious about who or what was in there, so I went and sat on the stone wall farthest from the cellar. I hoped whatever it was would come out. I didn't really think it would, but after about 10 minutes, something opened the door further, and I saw this shadowy shape. Okay, I was really freaking out now because it was something big, like 5 or 6 feet tall. Before I had much time to think, it jumped up all the steps at once. It turned its head toward me, but I didn't see any face. What I did see were these horrible red eyes that looked like they were glowing and looking right at me. I tried getting to my feet and just tumbled backwards off the wall. I crouched down there looking over, and I kid you not, this thing spread out these huge, black, leathery-looking wings and half jumped, half flew up into the trees. Oh my freaking God. I split out of there, running as fast as possible toward my car. I'm no runner, and by the time I got there, I thought I was going to die. I finally calmed down enough to drive, but all I could think on the way home was how I'd been in the cellar with that thing only like 10 feet away from me. How could something like that be real? I never went back there again. I want to start out by saying I had never heard of your show until just recently when I told this story to a couple friends of mine, and they told me I needed to hurry up and get it submitted to you. So here I go. I'm ready to tell you all about the time I ran into this strange creature on the prairies of North Dakota. It was a nice September evening and the opening weekend of deer season 2019. I was 21 and living back at home with my parents after college. It had been a hard year and I'd looked forward to hunting for months. Even bought myself a new deer stand in preparation for the hunt. It was the second day of the season, so according to North Dakota law, I was allowed to stay in my stand for half an hour after sunset. For years, it's been my usual routine to head out midday and set up my deer stand, then take the stand down just as dark starts creeping in. Years ago, my dad had taught me that the afternoon and evening were the best time to spot deer because they've come accustomed to the hustle and bustle of human life during the day and learned on their own to come out during the quiet parts of the evening when humans are usually scarce. I was pretty exhausted that particular morning. My cousin had, for some reason, planned her wedding for the same weekend, and I'd spend the night before tying one on with family and friends. When I climbed into the deer stand, I leaned back in my seat and yawned and stretched. I'd found a perfect quiet spot way out in the middle of an open acreage owned by a friend of the family who had given me permission to hunt the land. Off in the distance, I could hear the honking of Canada geese as they made their way south for the winter. Aside from them, I was completely alone out there. It was a perfectly clear and sunny afternoon and a comfortable high 60s in temperature. I had on my favorite jacket and a thermos of my grandma's hot cocoa to hold and enjoy, making the crisp and cool autumn air even more enjoyable. It's strange. When I first got up in that stand, I thought I was wide awake and ready for the hunt, even in spite of all the partying the night before. I didn't even realize I was falling asleep until I got woke up by the shaking of my deer stand. It was pitch black when I opened my eyes. I didn't know the time and was too panicked to check in the moment, but I'd later realize it was creeping up on midnight when I got woke up. I wasn't sure what was happening when I first got startled awake. It was clear that something was trying to shake me out of the tree, but I couldn't really place what it might be. There are no bears living in the area, and the musky smell of whatever it was far too strong to be that of a horse or a bull. I grabbed my flashlight from my jacket pocket and shone it down below me. Right away, I spotted a huge set of antlers. My thought was that it was a buck deer up on his hind legs trying to knock down the stand for some reason. But that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Deer are usually shy and skittish. There would be no reason for him to have suddenly attacked me as I slept. It wasn't all bad, though, because I had come out there to bag a buck, and there he was. I hesitated before reaching for my gun. It was well past nightfall and beyond the legal hunting hours, but I figured I had a pass to shoot this thing since it was actively trying to kill me, too. I pointed the barrel of the shotgun down right between the antlers and took aim, then pulled the trigger. It was only when the thing fell backwards did I realize that it was no normal deer. When it fell, I could tell that it wasn't built like a deer with a straight back and legs. Instead, it was almost cat-like in appearance with peaked shoulders and a thin waist. It shook its head at the feel of the bullet and then stood back up and looked at me. It stood on only the two back legs, like a human, and stared me right in the eyes. This thing was like nothing I'd ever seen before, but I knew right away what it was. The Wendigo is a popular figure in Native American folklore, and my dad's a member of the Dakota tribe. I knew from the stories that they can't be outrun, and they can't be shot with regular bullets. They regenerate faster than they bleed. Fortunately, they also can't climb. I made my way further up the tree and took shelter for the night. By sunrise, it had completely torn my new deer stand apart, but as the sun came up, it got bored enough to leave. I made my way down and gathered up the pieces of the stand and carried it back to my truck. I never told anyone what had happened with the stand to cause it so much damage. When I got home and my parents asked, I just shrugged it off and said it wasn't well built, but I think my dad might have known. The next time I went out, he handed me a cloth bag with silver bullets and told me to be careful. Apparently, once a Wendigo sets its sights on you, it doesn't give up. I'll never hunt without that bag in my kit again. As I learned, you never know when you might need them.